Good morning, afternoon, or evening for wherever you're joining us from. My name is Angie Judge from Dexibit. Since we first began the series on leading in crisis back in March, we've all had a tough few months. Our thoughts have been with those who have suffered loss or ill health and their families, and for many in our industry that have hit financial trouble as well, whether that's you as an individual or as an institution worrying about cash flow. And for all of us, I'm sure, being stuck at home for weeks on end has certainly taken its toll. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. Many countries have designed frameworks under which their reopening can occur, and several regions have now started relaxing their lockdown measures, or put a date on that at least. It's an uncertain future though. The only thing we know for sure is that when we do reopen, it's going to look nothing like it used to. And that's where scenario planning comes in. Today we're going to talk about how to plan for the worst, hope for the best, and monitor what happens in between. We've all seen in our government leaders the importance of considered data-informed decisions in leading through crisis, and the power of simulations or models in the face of an uncertain future. And the same is true when it comes to leading our own teams and visitor attractions, whether that's making advanced decisions or aligning operations and spend, and helping us paint a picture of what this new normal might look like for our team. Today, together with Pip Gilbert, the VP of Product at Dexibit, it is our pleasure to have Diana Pan, the Chief Technology Officer at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, joining us to share MoMA's story in using scenario planning as it leads its team through this. Diana has been a thought leader in the big data analytics space for the cultural sector, having made incredible discoveries through sentiment analysis and location analytics, machine learning, particularly as MoMA underwent a recent $450 million refurbishment, which just reopened in October of last year. Once again, as MoMA turns to data and leading through another period of change, this time with COVID-19, Diana's work in predictive analytics has provided a foundation from which scenario simulation has emerged. So following Diana's share today, we'll provide a look at scenario planning at an industry level, dive into how to design scenario assumptions for your venue, tease out how to unfold these into strategies and plans, and take a look at simulation in action. Today, we'll be referencing scenario simulation. This is a new tool in Dexibit's big data analytics solution that we have opened up free to visitor attractions during COVID-19 to help everyone get through together. So if you're trying this at home, so to speak, head to tour.dexibit.com to register. And with that, I will hand over to Diana.
Great. Hi, everyone. Today I'll be walking you through some of the planning in this difficult time that we're doing at MoMA. We could just jump over to the next slide. So MoMA closed, as with many institutions in New York, in mid-March, and we closed our doors to visitors. And we've been watching the crisis unfold around the world, and particularly in New York City. It's been an epicenter for many weeks with just such terrible, tragic things happening. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been seeing some improvements, and the state is finally starting to talk about reopening. The reopening will be based on federal and state guidance, and New York State is already planning to allow certain businesses to open as early as May 15th, which is really, really quite soon. But we are watching this very, very closely, and the latest I've heard is that the state will open businesses in several phases. As far as MoMA goes, that picture on the right I took yesterday was very sad. The barriers in front of the grand entrance on 53rd Street. We are starting to plan our reopening, and of everything that we're thinking and looking at, safety is the absolute top priority. So everything we do is with safety in mind. We can hop over to the next slide. So some of the assumptions that we're going into our planning with is social distancing is clearly going to be a part of our life in the foreseeable future. And what that means as we think about it is we can look at the capacity in our galleries, we can look at the capacity in our public spaces, and we can probably, we are in fact doing mathematical models around, okay, if we have to keep 6 feet distance, what does that mean in terms of the number of people we can have in a particular space? And we'll certainly do that, but also we want to make sure that we're creating this in such a way that people are going to feel comfortable coming back. So, providing, so we're going to look at capacity, but we're going to probably be very conservative so that people feel like, oh, this space is like a garden. It's got very open areas where I don't feel crowded. And so that social distancing is like a really key part now in our planning. The other aspect is, I think in this new normal world, no one's going to want to touch anything. And so all of our transactions, all of the checkpoints we're looking at from a contactless perspective. How do we do the same things and provide the same excellent experience to our visitors in a contactless, minimal contact way? And so we know that there'll be operational changes to support that. So for example, how do we do bag check, coat check with minimal contact? So every aspect of our operations is being scrutinized in that way, so that when visitors come back, and we'll certainly send them a pre-visit email saying, please be prepared with these types of things after you have purchased your ticket online. Be aware that we may be implementing these precautions for your safety and to promote contactless transactions. So we want visitors to feel very comfortable when they come back. So the other thing is that that's about our visitors, but even before we bring our visitors in, we need to bring our staff in to prepare the museum with all of these changes. And with staff return, it's quite complicated because our staff needs to feel comfortable, and probably that's more important than anything. They need to run the museum. And so we're being very sensitive about making sure the staff feels like this is going to be a safe environment, whether they'll have all their protective gear, masks, and guidelines on how to remain safe are all things that we've been planning. We also have to recognize that a lot has changed in the last 7 or 8 weeks. Schools are closed. Transportation is while the state is cleaning our subways more than ever, people feel uncomfortable just getting to the museum, whether it's staff or visitors. And so we have to assume that we may not be fully staffed in the way that we would like to be in order to run the museum as in the way that we normally do. And so what that means is that possibly some galleries will have to be closed, or some spaces, public spaces, will have to be closed or have different operational hours. So these are all things that we're thinking about and assuming that we'll have to in some way solve. And then the thought is that everyone has cabin fever, and they're all just dying for the state to lift these restrictions so they can get out, they can do stuff, they can go shopping, go to museums, go to theaters. And so everyone is going to come to the museum as soon as we're open, we hope. And so the museum is going to be as busy as we allow it to be. So that's one thought, that's one line of thought. And then there's this other line of thought that everyone's going to be anxious. And even when the state lifts its restrictions, no one's going to want to leave their home anymore because everyone's used to working from home. And so, as you can see, these are two completely contradictory lines of thinking in terms of how visitors will come back or not come back to the museum. And we're trying to find our way, navigate our way through this, given that either of those could happen. So really, no one knows. So going to the next slide, in terms of considerations, just with those assumptions in mind. So enforcing social distancing, it's an interesting problem, but to do so, the first step, of course, is to just evaluate all of the capacity in the museum. And then what we're going to do is wait for the state to also provide some guidance, because in some areas, I think the government is asking business owners or restaurants to limit the capacity to perhaps 50% of what they normally receive. And so we'll certainly, number one, take the guidance from our local officials, and then we'll probably, to make our visitors and staff feel safe, we'll probably even reduce that further. So we'll approach it in an extremely conservative way. In addition, we'll probably look at various ways of ticketing. So certainly timed ticket entry is something that we are considering, because we know if we have timed entry, then we can better control the flow of visitors into the museum. Whether we're going to do that or not, we're still weighing, and we're weighing some other options related to ticketing. The lobby, the large lobby and public space that we have since the reopening in October 2019, it's a space we had anticipated visitors to come to and linger and meet with their friends. And so we provided a great deal of seating and areas where people can get their ticket and then have a chance to relax and take a look at the maps and the guides to see where they want to go in their journey next. However, in this new world, we may not want people to linger. We may remove some of the seating so as to encourage people to make their way up into the galleries where there's even more space, and so that we're able to distribute the visitors, the few visitors that come, because we're limiting capacity. We want to distribute them throughout the museum as quickly as possible. And so there are operational changes that we have to consider, especially in the lobby. And then, of course, with the staffing question on, well, exactly who will come back from our staff to support the front lines, to support the store, the retail store and ticketing and other operational aspects. So we will only do things safely for our visitors, and that depends on the staff. And so staffing is a major consideration as well as we go into this. We would not, for example, open the museum even if we don't feel that we have the staff coverage that we need, so that a visitor's experience is as good as it should be, even to pre-pandemic levels. And then the other aspect to think about is the visitor's journey begins when they leave their home. And so transportation, New York City subways, mass transit, are people going to be comfortable? So we're looking at what amenities we may be able to provide visitors when they come to the museum, so that there's all kinds of options. Bike transportation, would they be able to easily find a place to put their bikes? So we're looking at that. We're looking at potentially different hours, and these are things that everyone should consider. Look at different hours to support off-peak hour transportation hours, as well as I know there's a lot of supermarkets, groceries have instituted earlier hours for self-selected people in the high-risk groups. And whether we do anything like that, we're learning from other vertical industry sectors, and then we'll decide what's best suited for us. But those are all things that we're also considering in terms of different hours. So as we go into the next slide for how we're doing this, MoMA, in terms of how, just pragmatically, how do you address all these sudden new changes? So our staff, we have a crisis team, and within the crisis team, we formed a number of subgroups, task forces that have gone off to study very specific areas. And these are a couple of examples of them. One of them is first and foremost focused on everything related to staff, peace of mind coming back to the museum, staff health, social distancing for staff, whether we have staggered hours, whether we have shifts of teams coming in and then shifts working from home, continuing to work from home. Those are all things that we're looking at in order to operate the museum, how to shift the way the staff works to still support a fully open museum. And then we have a subgroup that's looking at all the touch points that a visitor might encounter before they even reach our galleries. And so that means transportation to the museum, ticketing, membership, security bag check, and wayfinding. Do we still hand out maps to visitors? Should we continue to be all digital and think about whether we want to hand out anything? What do we do with if visitors show up without face masks? Because right now the guidance is that if you're in a public space and you could be 6 feet within 6 feet with another person, you are required to wear a face mask. And so how do we handle those types of situations? And then after that, we have another subgroup that's looking at, okay, our visitor has a ticket ready to go up into the galleries. What is that in-gallery experience going to be like? How do we continue to enforce social distancing? How do we look at each gallery and proactively perhaps alert a security guard if it starts to become too crowded? And so putting technology in place, leveraging technology and helping the staff to enforce some of these new guidelines, I think is another aspect that we're looking at very closely. And we've been able to maintain our digital audience grow, which is very exciting. So we know our visitors, our audience is still very engaged and very interested in what we have to offer. And so continuing that digital presence, I think is another aspect that's very important, and we'll continue to do that. So the result of these task forces, because ultimately these task forces will determine, okay, do we do time ticketing? Okay, if we're going to limit capacity, what does that mean? Do we allow 5,000 people in per day instead of the expected 10,000? And so the guidelines, the work resulting from these task forces ultimately will help determine some of the range of factors that we're going to use to do visitation forecasts for the next year. So in speaking about forecasts on the next slide, just to take a step back, in a world pre-pandemic, MoMA, as I'm sure most of the institutions represented on this webinar, spend a good amount of time before each year, fiscal year, projecting what visitation might look like based on factors, the exhibition programming, the attendance from previous years, what does New York City and international travel and tourism look like, student group estimates, and then also just general seasonal weather trends and traffic associated with those trends. And we put together a projection, a forecast, a day-to-day forecast that estimates, okay, we expect 5,000 people on this day and 10,000 another day, and so on and so forth. And then every day we review it and we take some action if it's not exactly matching what we hope or the trend is different. And so we've been doing this for many years in somewhat of a manual way. And over the last year, we've been in parallel using a machine learning model, as I've shown on this right side of this page, where we're able to feed a machine a lot of different factors and historical information and let it calculate a forecast for us. And we've been monitoring this very carefully to see the accuracy of it. And it's been extremely promising, although towards the end there, in that particular graph, the traffic drops off because that reflects when the museum closed. But the model, the machine learning model, as it learns along the way, has been extremely promising for us. So we'll be looking more and more towards that. So again, pre-pandemic forecasting, we build out one forecast and then we review it on a regular basis. So how do you do that? How do you do the same type of forecasting in the age of coronavirus? On the next slide. How do you create a forecast when you know, for example, many things will change? In fact, everything on this page, these are things that we look at, factors that we look at when we build a forecast. But now the only thing we could really count on is that it's going to be extremely hard to predict any of these things. And what that means is that we have to think about each factor in a range. And so foreign visitation, for example, with all the travel bans and certain borders closed, countries that have been top visitors for us might see 0% for the first couple of months that we're open. And so we have to think about a range of 0 to 5% maybe in the first 3 months. And then in the second 3 months, we have to look carefully to see if we can change that range and how. The same thing goes with domestic travel. While New York City has been such an epicenter for this virus, it has already pockets, epicenters around the country have developed over the last several weeks as well. And so who knows what travel between states will be like. And so domestic visitation is another one that we'll be watching closely. New York, we hope, New York and local visitors are the ones that we hope we can count on because we have mass transit and people can walk to the museum. But we don't really know if after all these weeks of being working from home and quarantine, whether people will want to step out of the safe confines of their home. And so this is, again, a range that we have to think about. We're constantly in touch with our member base, but we don't know at what rate they'll be rushing back to the museum when we open, and so on and so forth. So these are all factors now that at one point with any given year that we're fairly confident in what each factor might be. And there's a range even in any given year, but the range is maybe, say, 40 to 45% difference, versus now the range could be 0% to 30% or 40%. And so those are big ranges. And so what that means is we really need to build many forecasts. And so that's where some of the scenario simulations come in, because you're not just building one forecast now, you have to build many different forecasts. So on the next slide, where we're thinking about simulating all kinds of scenarios based on the ranges associated with each of these factors. So, so the way we look at it at MoMA is we start with our base pre-pandemic forecast. That's our well, we're not going to ever reach that because there's the pandemic, so we don't even have to go into that. But we do have a base. We have a base forecast. But now we have to build in a scenario where it's the worst possible situation. What does the worst case scenario look like? And then what's the best case scenario look like? And we tweak all of those factors and probably many others to build that kind of model, worst and best case. And then we build in the likely cases where maybe it's not going to be 0% foreign visitation for the entire year, but maybe instead of 40 or 50%, it's going to be more like 20%. Maybe that's an optimistic, but not totally unreasonable scenario. And so now as we look at forecasting, we're looking at it in terms of many different forecast scenarios. And then when we do reopen, we'll revisit these scenarios and see which one is coming closer to what we're seeing in real life. And so we identify these triggers, we build out the scenarios, and then initially we manually enter some of these factors, triggers. And then hopefully as the world reopens, we can rely on the software to dynamically calculate what these triggers should be. So for example, right now, if I look at foreign visitation, I'll just put in there 0%. If we reopen tomorrow, it's probably 0% for foreign visitation. But in 3 months, where we would like to see this somewhat more dynamic, where we can just have software that goes out and figures out, oh, okay, there's been an increase in airline traffic, and so we're seeing foreign visitation into New York has increased by this percentage, and that translates to perhaps this percentage for foreign visitation to a museum. And so this is how we're approaching scenario simulation, and the idea is to revisit this, save your simulations, continue to iterate over them, continue to adjust the pattern to get a better understanding of what the rest of the fiscal year might look like. So I don't know if this will work, but this is the approach that we're taking at the museum. That's pretty much all I have, but I would like to leave everybody with a image of the future, and when people are allowed to come and visit the museum again. This is Starry Night, one of our most popular pieces, and I'm excited for everyone on this call to be able to travel and come to New York, and specifically come to MoMA and see this beautiful work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was such a fascinating look. And we've had a ton of questions come in. So I'm going to take a moment to ask one or two now, and then we'll save the rest for towards the end of the session. And there's been quite a few questions here about online reservations and time ticketing. People are curious, will all of your visitors need to reserve online tickets, or can people still walk in spontaneously and purchase a ticket contactless at the museum? And are you thinking about dwell time or sort of capacity assumptions about how long people will stay for? Because that time ticketing brings operational concerns of moving guests through and leaving when their time slot is over.
Yeah, so I can answer that. First, I'll say that we haven't made any final decision yet. We are looking at time ticketing to help to control the flow of visitors into the museum for sure. But we always have to anticipate that people will just show up at the museum. And we also have to anticipate that people might have special passes or paying by cash. And so I think if we go with the approach of online tickets and online time tickets, we will encourage people to do that for sure. And it's really for the safety of the visitors and the staff and their own comfort level to purchase their tickets in a manner as contactless as possible. But for those who just show up, we will find a way for them to purchase a ticket as well. And it could be something as simple as a QR code that we have on signage that you can just scan and will take you directly to an online purchase. So even if you just show up, will enable you to do contactless purchase as well. But for the people who come and pay cash or have special passes, those will have to have some kind of minimal contact, I'm guessing. And so again, I just want to emphasize we have not at all made a decision, but we're looking at it through the lens of safety and contactless transactions. In terms of dwell time, We generally know what our visitor dwell time is over the last several years of looking at Wi-Fi data. We have a good understanding of a visitor's tolerance for modern and contemporary art. We also have to think about whether we're going to have our restaurants open during the early weeks or months, because sometimes that will increase overall dwell time within the museum. Yes, there are operational challenges if the dwell time isn't so easily predictable, but we feel we know what it is, and we'll be carefully monitoring it still with our Wi-Fi data. And if we find that we need to adjust some of the time ticket entry points, assuming we go with time tickets, then we'll adjust it in that way. While we want to build in a lot of precautions, we also don't want to just overthink things and build in too much, especially when in the early weeks we're going to be, and it's more of let's watch and see, and let's see how visitors come in and how they're reacting, and then learn and adapt, and we'll make it even better. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, it does. It's going to be really interesting to look at all of those before and after metrics of things like dwell time and see what this new normal looks like. And we've got lots and lots of questions coming in, so we will come back to those towards the end of the session, but thank you, Diana, for sharing that.
Sure.
So when we reopen, we're inevitably going to end up in one of two situations. Either we have tight restrictions and too many visitors, which creates a capacity management problem, and I know there's been a lot of questions about that today, or too few visitors, especially given the operating costs of having to open a public venue, which results in a need to stimulate the market or deal with a growth generation problem, or face having to cut costs further. But just like when the crisis initially struck in March, we found ourselves in this blur of a very fast moving situation, having to make decisions really quickly. When we reopen, this moment of relative stillness that we're enjoying now will be over, and we'll be back into that washing machine. With so many unknowns, simulation helps us model what those various futures might look like. And that way we can make the most of our time up our sleeves now and preparing and our best efforts to stay ahead of the game, and take that time to prepare all of those decisions around finance and marketing and operations and more, so that if those situations start to unfold, we know what plan of action our team can swing into. We've compared trying to lead during COVID-19 to the equivalent of building an airplane while flying it. And so to extend that analogy, scenario planning and simulation is a special tool, a bit like what pilots use to practice their approach and landing, so that when they're up in the air with all of those passengers' lives on board, they know what levers to pull and how to navigate so they don't skid sideways down the runway or worse yet, overshoot it. We put together a crisis framework of survive then thrive, which we put up on our first webinar back in March. And you can see here, this yellow section, simulate, is the first step for once we've assessed the situation and swung into response mode with continuity plans, as we all are now. But unlike most crises, I think, which are relatively short-lived, this one's definitely going to be a marathon rather than a sprint. We won't bounce out of this thing. We're going to have to climb our way out. And that's where data becomes so important, because it's not our job necessarily to have all of the answers right now, but instead to come up with lots of great questions and hypothesize and test and learn and rinse and repeat. And simulation is a really great starting point to do that with. Traditionally, most visitor attractions, I think, that have been around for a few years operate fairly easily in a business as usual mode. The next year or more will be anything but normal. And so we almost have to treat this time like we're starting afresh and revisit all the assumptions that we take for granted, like how price sensitive visitors are, how much money they spend at the shop, what % of members churn on a given year. And simulation helps us think about what that world looks like when that foundation of normal moves underneath our feet. So speaking of an absence of normal, in that first session we had together back in March, Laura Lott from AAM talked about the absence of certainty. and how in that situation we have to instead imagine a range of futures. And so if we start to imagine what those look like, for our best case scenario at the moment, we could have a fairly imminent reopening for some regions once we begin moving out of lockdowns. And what are we now, 10 weeks into this thing, accompanied by maybe a little bit of pent-up demand, although we heard from our colleagues in Asia on the session a few weeks back that that's not been their experience. But perhaps given some time, we might see some relief on border restrictions ruling out international tourism at the moment. But our worst case scenario for many regions, by their own decisions or for some venues, that closure might continue on until next quarter or even the one after that for some parts of the world. International tourism may be completely off the cards for 2020 and still a relative unknown for 2021. And we have perhaps only begun to see the market upheaval resulting from that with companies like Hertz. And some of us may be impacted very directly. For example, if we get a lot of visitors through an online travel agency or a ticket reseller like a city pass operator, and their business survival is at threat from those tourism market changes. So on our website at covid.dexibit.com, you'll find a situation report which dives into this in more depth and looks at what we're hearing on the street from industry and centralizes some of the health, economic and lockdown orders from government and other authorities, including differences by region. In terms of the three sets of macro indicators that we're monitoring to keep an eye on these potential situations, these range from the global experience through this crisis, like what the R0 value is, how contagious the disease is, through to regional things like what our local regulations might be enforcing, say in terms of capacity limits like we've heard today. And one of the things that we're paying really particular attention to of the things that we don't know right now are these indicators that relate to how long this crisis is going to go on for. Things like antibody feasibility, reinfection risk, mutations, vaccine likelihood or lead time, because these are the factors that determine whether we're staring down a 12, 24, 36 month or God forbid even longer time frame of recovery. And another really interesting thing I think here is this piece around the test and contact tracing capabilities, because these are the two levers that our governments can use to try and wrangle this curve. And without these capabilities, the risk of rolling shutdowns or heightened public fear is very real. So from our understanding of an ever-evolving situation, which is a job in itself to keep abreast of, we then end up with 1,000 conversations and what ifs amongst our teams. You know, what if we're capacity limited? What if schools don't go back until the fall? What if they don't tour this year? And all of these unknowns really start to pile up. And each one of them in its own right is quite hard to action anything from. And yet there's so many of these possibilities that it's impossible right now just to bet on what one future might look like. So what we suggest is to start designing scenarios of best case, worst case, and most probable case at least, and then working backwards from these macroeconomic perspectives of health and economics and industry indicators. From that situation report, we can then translate that big picture into conditions that directly impact our venues, and then eventually into these assumptions that we're managing from. And from that, we can then simulate the effects of these and start to make decisions or plan decisions for what to do in case they come true. And this is what that looks like. For example, foreign affairs, which translate into travel restrictions, either at our region or the origin of our visitors, that then translate into tourism demand, that translates into visitation, often from audience that spend more in the museum, that then translate into where we spend our advertising dollars and what content we put up for them, perhaps things like what languages we offer tours in, and our assumptions around those average revenue per visitor metrics, and so much more. So if you're workshopping all of this with your team, you could use a template like this. For each of these major assumptions, we can plot that best case, worst case, most probable case. And as usual, we'll be sending our slides out following today's webinar, and you can also download this poster kit at the link there at the top right. So as you can imagine, as we start in that top bar there, we can work through, say, our reopen date versus where we think we might see a month-long rolling shutdown in the fall, and then another one after the holiday travel season, maybe in January. In purple, we can see these capacity regulations that we might either subject ourselves to or be limited to by government. In pink, we can see the opening hours and days. We might want to increase our hours to spread visitation or shorten them to manage costs. In orange, we can see our group bookings, particularly from tours. We know how tricky it is for schools to manage student safety and social distancing. We might choose to delay exhibitions or cancel tours or have only certain rides or experience running at certain times of the day. We might be banned from holding events. And green, there we might find our audiences are more price sensitive, despite the fact that we need to really charge more and to make up for capacity reductions at the moment. And so as we build out these best, worst, probable cases, we start to have the bones or skeleton of what we need to simulate what these scenarios look like, and we can start to build out a response plan to handle them. So I will hand over Pip now to take us through that.
Thanks, Angie. So there's a number of ways to approach building a simulation, and for many it's the choice between, say, a quick back of the envelope estimate or a vast spreadsheet comprising many complex calculations. With that in mind, we have put together this free scenario simulation tool, really thinking about how helping you cope with complexity without sacrificing speed. And so with the great input from Diana and other Dexibit customers, we were able to use our experience in predicting and analysing visitor behaviour to support the industry at this time. So what you can see on screen here in the orange is, for this hypothetical venue, actual visitation up until the point of closure. The dotted line on the other side represents the baseline forecast that was produced using our very industry-specific machine learning models and trained on the data specific to this venue, showing what visitation might have been had there been no COVID. The biggest assumption that we all have front of mind is when we might reopen. So you can see I can apply an assumption here. Perhaps we're expecting an additional closure beyond that point. Modelling this is quick and easy, and I really love how you can see this dance before your eyes. You can see the solid blue line here representing the scenario has dropped as I've toggled these assumptions on. Also, there's a count of the lost visitors below so that you can see what the contribution of each of these assumptions is. It's likely that international tourism will be off the cards for some time, as Angie's already mentioned. Perhaps we're even expecting lower domestic visits. Or conversely, we could be thinking that there'll be more from our local audiences. A capacity limit might be needed to temper that demand with what we're able to cope with from our social distancing obligations. But my favourite feature here is the overlay of a demand control. So as we've talked about, it's likely that people will be hesitant to return to their public sites. And that might lead to a bit of a slow ramp up in visitors. Something like this would take me forever to build in Excel, so we're really delighted to be able to bring this to you at no charge. So with scenarios in hand, we turn our attention to how we might use these to plan and respond strategically. Traditionally, visitor attractions is quite a stable industry, and now we've been thrown into something that's far more akin to a startup type environment. And so we can borrow from and draw from the strategic frameworks that are used in these environments to help us navigate the uncertain times. When making decisions on incomplete information and then using those assumptions that have informed each scenario, we need to closely monitor our internal and external situation and the impact of those decisions that we're making. And so what you see on screen here is called a feedback loop. From scenario creation down in the bottom right-hand corner through to decision and planning, we closely monitor the data available and then regularly review that broader macroeconomic context to feed back into an ongoing revision of those scenarios to inform an adjusted course of action. Now, the higher the level of uncertainty, the tighter and faster this loop should be. And so what you'll no doubt notice is that feedback loops like these, particularly when tight and fast, require really good visibility of key metrics and situation reports. And so how do we actually move from having these in place from having our scenarios into a plan? How do we even begin identifying the decisions and actions we need to take? I think that's one of the most common conversations we're having across our customer base at the moment. On the next page, we have another handy framework. This one brings together the elements that are needed to create a response plan across that range of scenarios that Angie's talked to, the best, the probable, and the worst. Now, this is just a suggestion of having 3 to begin with. That's quite an achievable number, but with a highly adaptable scenario tool, you may look at more. When you're looking across these scenarios and thinking about what decisions you might take, it's really important that the underlying assumptions are front and center, as it's changes in these that will indicate that the scenario and therefore the plan itself may no longer be valid. For each scenario, with the assumptions listed right in front of you and the outputs of the simulation, you have that visual frame of reference to inform the decisions that make up your plan. So as well as identifying how the scenario affects your strategic position down at the bottom of the page there, you can also note those metrics and data that you'll need to get monitoring in place. If we zoom in on the midsection, within each scenario, we recommend considering how it might impact different parts of your venue. We've noted some key functions here, but you could adapt this to align with your structure and your areas of responsibility. When working through the questions that you can see on screen for each scenario, and remember to do this for each and every distinct scenario that you are looking at. Remember that each part of the organisation doesn't operate in isolation, and so the decisions are interconnected and cascade across all parts of the venue. By noting them in a single place, you can begin to develop a holistic view and an integrated plan of action. And you may wish to get out the virtual whiteboards and get together via a video conference to really brainstorm and work through these together. When translating the decisions into actions, I always find decision paralysis can be a real enemy. And so we've represented here a way of thinking about the large number of decisions that will come up through these brainstorming sessions. As you look across that single view of all scenarios, you can more easily identify the no regrets moves. These are the things that have no negative implication regardless of which scenario comes to bear. They're usually things that you might have been considering anyway prior to COVID and just haven't had the trigger to act. So for example, maybe you've been thinking about adjusting your opening days or hours to align with demand. Option creators are decisions that might have positive impact under a particular scenario, but only have a small risk of there being negative impact in other scenarios. So an example of an option creator may be to rebalance your marketing spend to target local audiences. That will have large payoffs in a scenario with no tourism, but minimal negative effect should tourism resume. Big bets are the decisions with the potential for significant payoff or significant negative impact, and they're highly dependent on the scenario that plays out. And so by sorting your decisions into these buckets, you can very quickly see and identify these big bets where you need to spend a bit more time weighing up the pros and cons to align on an acceptable level of risk. But in uncertain times, even with the most rigorous planning process, things are very unlikely to play out exactly as you've planned. And so the questions at the right of the screen here are really to keep front and center during any discussions that you're having. Fundamentally, the crux of them is what we believe to be true or probable still the case? And if not, how might our scenarios and plans be adjusted? By managing to a probable scenario, we're able to make data-informed decisions to identify potential pivot points. And so what you see here in the dotted line is a representation of potential post-reopening actual data coming in. And you can see the point at which it moves outside of the bounds of that probable scenario. And this would be the point at which you would assess whether you need to iterate on that scenario, change it up, respond to that new information, and quickly change your plan. And so having a tool that you can easily make those changes that you need is going to be incredibly powerful during this time. I think my final thought here is at the beginning of today's session, we talked about using simulation to make sure that when you're landing the plane, you don't overshoot the runway. and the chief of all decisions, whether you're simulating in advance or monitoring progress as you go, are those that contribute to financial runway. So using your simulations to understand whether a scenario places you in the lower left corner here in a place of safety or in the upper right in a place of danger, you're going to have the best chance for survival and ultimately sustainability. And with that, I will hand back to Angie.
Thank you so much, Pip. And I know we've had a flood of questions come in, so do keep those coming. Those that we can't answer today, we will reach out afterwards with some more content on. Dinah, a couple here for you. How do you plan to balance gallery closure and its implications to the museum's capacity? Is there sort of some square footage allotment that you're using to calculate the space you need per visitor?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you close galleries, you're making the number of square feet available for visitors smaller, and so we are calculating an assumption of every visitor has to have n number of approximate feet around them. So, but the other aspect that we're thinking about is we're going to be so far below the number of visitors. Our capacity limits are going to be so low in the initial weeks that even with closures, probably if we had to, we're trying not to, but if we did, it wouldn't be a problem. It would come nowhere close to the minimum number per person. So we're basically making sure that there's way more space than needed, because part of it is also a perception for visitors. They want to feel like they're going into a near empty gallery. I think I saw some other questions regarding technologies used to enforce some of this. This goes very much hand in hand with technology, and we're leveraging camera data. We're leveraging camera data to estimate number of people in galleries, as well as people counter technologies to help us with some of this, the reporting of it, and also real-time reporting so that we can respond when something happens.
And what's that leadership dynamic like? The role of your CEO, Glenn Lowry, in scenario planning, how does that fit in a range between requesting staff develop or recommend scenarios and then proactively driving that whole picture?
I would say that the entire senior leadership team is driving this. We're all part of it. We all own a part of it. So it's been a very collaborative effort across MoMA. Everyone is anxious to reopen, as I'm sure that's true with every single institution. Every day that we spend home, we miss our colleagues, we miss the museum, and we're very anxious to get back in business. And so it's been very much driven and supported by senior leadership.
Very cool. And one, I'll throw at you, Pip, and we've got one here. How have you incorporated assumptions for services in addition to attendance? So things like food service, the retail shop, performances, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, Diana, if you've got thoughts.
No.
Go ahead.
So at MoMA, restaurants and other amenities, retail, because the retail stores are tighter, there's just smaller square footage. We're looking at that very closely. We're looking at dwell time, because that could vary quite a bit. And so that we're looking at both dwell time and capacity, and looking at the layout of the retail store as well. So that's got a lot more and different factors than the museum galleries themselves. For restaurants, we have a partnership with an external vendor, and we'll probably work with them on next steps there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Diana. Great considerations. And I would add to that we'd encourage taking the scenarios that you create, whatever your methodology of simulation, and overlaying perhaps a per cap or a average revenue received per visitor in your normal times to help you understand what the performance of those different lines of business might be. Where you might have noticed that the tool itself that I shared is still in beta mode, where that's something that we're going to be adding in the coming weeks to help those that choose to use it with that. So we're quite excited about the additional insight that you'll be able to gather from that.
Very cool. And one last question that's come in, and then we'll wrap up for a time and try and answer the rest online, of what you need to make it work. And how it works. So, and I can jump in and answer that one. So to make scenario simulation work, you are going to need your daily totals of visitation for the last 12 months prior to closure. And that then is used to train these machine learning models that then make that prediction of what normal would have looked like. And then you use your manual assumptions to start controlling how you want to pull that picture away for things like the tourism and capacity and changes to opening hours and days, etc. So that was 12 months of daily visitation. The tool will provide its own regional context of things like public holidays and school holidays to pick up on patterns and trends that it sees in your data. So one last note, if you haven't got your copy already, head to resources.dexibit.com for that Survive and Thrive white paper for visitor attractions responding to COVID-19, which is free to download. And you'll also find this really great scenario simulation kit, which has got lots of the posters we looked at today from these slides to help work through some of these decisions with your team. And remember to register for scenario simulation. So that's at tour.dexibit.com. Our mission at Dexibit is to power our cultural future using big data analytics to predict and analyze visitor behavior. So with this industry facing such a big threat, we are doing everything we can to help venues of all shapes and sizes get through. So all you need to make that work is that year of daily visitation totals. Thank you so much, Diana, for joining us today and sharing MoMA's journey, and to everyone who has dialed in from all around the world. And thank you, especially those who have written in with such kind words following all of these webinars. Your very touching notes have been a real joy to our team, and we greatly appreciate the feedback. We'll be sharing a session, a recording and slides from today for everyone who registered. And for those like MoMA who are going through a major refurb or are about to embark on a new build venue, we have a special webinar coming up next time on new builds facing COVID-19, which features the National Museum of the US Army, the US Olympic and Paralympic Museum, and Weta Workshop's latest location-based experience. So it'll be a really exciting session. We're looking forward to hearing and sharing everyone's stories as your doors open in the coming weeks and months ahead. And I hope those moments of welcoming those first few visitors back through the doors is a really joyful moment of celebration for you and your teams. So in the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you all again next time.